So it's a pleasure to be here. I'm very honored to be part of this organization, to be giving you guys this address. It is kind of lonely, as some of you may have experienced, being a libertarian and a Christian. And I think some of that is just due to the perception. So I just want to make that clear in case you feel isolated. On my blog, every Sunday, I have a religious post. So that's what I do. Like on Sunday, I just do a religious post. And the other 6 days a week, it's all Austrian economics and libertarianism. And I routinely would get, they kind of have stopped doing this now because it would get repetitious, but people would routinely say, Bob, how are you so smart and rational 6 days a week? And then on Sunday, it all goes out the window, and you start talking about the Bible and all this crazy stuff, right? And so that's the context in which I'm going to give my remarks today. And I just want to let you know and encourage you that, don't be afraid of that. Don't let people scare you into keeping your head down and your mouth shut. I get lots of people emailing me saying, hey, I'm really glad that you're putting that stuff on your blog out there, and there's a voice like that, and in addition to the other people who are speaking out like this, and they say, I am a Christian and a libertarian. I've been a libertarian for such a number of years, but I don't talk about that on social media because I don't feel like getting my head bitten off by these militant atheists, right? So that's the kind of stuff, the encouragement I get, so that's partly why I do it. But let me also sort of guard against any sort of smugness or superiority and say what I try to do is sort of address atheist arguments coming from a libertarian perspective, because we'll see there is a certain logic to it. So it's not merely that, hey, there happen to be a lot of self-described libertarians who are also vehemently anti-theistic or vehemently anti-organized religion, that in their minds, it's not just, some people like vanilla, I like chocolate. It's not merely that. They think they're being consistent, and it's the theistic libertarians who are the ones who are confused. So you may have heard they'll have like phrases like, no gods, no rulers, right? Or they might say, how can you guys not see this? How do the liberal progressives, how do they work, right? They tell people, you need us. Without us, you're helpless. You need us. That's why you got to follow our orders. Give us, your power over your life. Oh, and by the way, give us a bunch of your money. And they say, what does the church do? Well, without us, you're a wretched, miserable sinner. You're bound to eternal destruction. You need us to tell you the truth. You need to follow all these rules we lay down for your life. Oh, and by the way, give us your money, right? So you can see how in their mind, we're the ones who are being inconsistent. Even on its own terms, it would be great if the state only wanted 10%. I'll just put it that way. But so even there, it's like, okay. So, but having said all that, and also, just so you know, and I don't mean to bring this up to be about my personal background, but it might help you understand where I'm coming from and why I'm sincere when I say I really get this position and I'm sympathetic to it and I try to, grapple with it on its own terms and not judge people, is because when I was in college, I was an atheist, right? I called myself a devout atheist. I thought that was really clever. I would go around to religious people, students, my friends, and I would try to convince them to become an atheist, right? And so I would do things like somebody who was raised as a Baptist or something. I would say, give me a break. If your parents had been Muslim, you would believe in Allah, right? And the kid would be like, yeah, probably, And so I would do stuff like that. And fortunately, my roommate was a solid Christian and convinced my friend, don't listen to Bob. He's being goofy. So I'm relieved that I don't think in my mind flipped anybody. But just so you know, at the time, I wasn't doing it to be like a troublemaker, or I didn't get thrills out of blowing up people's worldviews. I thought I was freeing them, right? Just like if I were talking to people and saying, you think you need the state to provide schools and roads and and postal delivery. I still can't believe people think that, right? And I would say, you don't need them. Look at how voluntary market associations could do all these things. You don't need them. That's what I thought I was doing in the theological realm with these people, right? So I thought I was freeing them, but also I wasn't all, just a nice guy or anything. I was smug. Just to give you an example of the smugness, we had... There was these things called the CCA's Center for Constructive Alternatives. I was a student at Hillsdale, and they would bring in these speakers. And so one guy was up there giving a talk saying, hey, when you go into the business world, if you own a business, make God the CEO of your company, right? Like that was like the title of his talk. So you can imagine where he was going with that talk. And there's hundreds of people in the auditorium and all the faculty and stuff. Very well-meaning talk, perfectly nice guy. Just saying, keep God in mind. Don't just go to church on Sunday and then be a cutthroat businessman the other, 5 days. That's what his message was. So me, being funny and clever, you get to ask questions at the end. And so I was going to get up, to impress my friends and get to the microphone and say, so yeah, if I make God the CEO of my company or whatever, when there's a board meeting, does he get 1 vote or 3? Right? And that's what I was planning on doing. Thank goodness that they ran out of time before I got to the microphone, right? That would have been horribly embarrassing. But so that's, and one last thing again, when I tell you how seriously I took this stuff, I would go and read refutations of Christianity, stuff like Thomas Paine's The Age of Reason. There's a book, I think, called Atheism. I think it was by George Smith. Mencken's book, A Treatise on the Gods. And I thought, these guys are good, but they didn't do it well enough. And I was taking it upon myself. I had planned on writing the definitive refutation of Christianity. All right, so that's where I'm coming from. So believe me when I say I understand these viewpoints. And I won't get into it now because I want to get onto the the material for today's talk. But I had a personal experience, and I can just assure you, intellectual arguments would not have flipped me. They would have bounced off of me. And it's looking back now, I can remember my mental state at that time and how certain arguments, like people had given me C.S. Lewis, and I would read it and be like, no, there's a fallacy here in line 7 of his argument, and I could sit there and put it in a box and say, nope. Now, with my newfound perspective, reading C.S. Lewis and so on, oh my gosh, how did I miss that? Or why did I reject this at the time? I can remember that I did it. It's hard for me to remember, what my mental frame was. So I just want to assure you that that's the issue. And of course, by me giving these arguments, I think this is going to be online eventually, and I'm sure atheist libertarians will see this stuff. I am under no illusions that these intellectual arguments are going to flip them. Just as with me, it didn't take that it was personal revelation, I guess you would call it, personal experience. And so I just want to say that, and that's why I am by no means judging anybody, and if I do in this talk sort of sound sarcastic or something, it's merely for entertainment value. It's just after lunch. I'm trying to keep everybody awake. I certainly understand why somebody could sincerely believe this, be an atheist and think, what are you guys talking about? Don't you see how the church is trying to control people just like the state and so on? Okay, so the topic that I'm addressing is God a tyrant? The answer is no. Thanks, everybody. Right? You probably want more than that. So let me elaborate. We've got some more time. I'm going to read from, this is something from Christopher Hitchens. Now, I didn't pick this. I had people on my blog in the comments in one of these Sunday blog posts where I talk about religious stuff, and the critics come at me. And they were saying, oh, there's a great quote from Hitchens. I believe the context of this, I couldn't quite pin it down. I think this is from a debate, so this isn't something he wrote in a book. I think this is him speaking orally, and this is from a debate. It's a little bit of a long quote, but you'll see where I'm going with this and why I'm reading such a long quote from him. And so this is Hitchens, and it's going to motivate the topic to show it's, just to give you the context, the idea is, yes, an atheist who was also a libertarian thinks the Bible's a bunch of myths, right? And, oh, come on, you don't believe in Zeus, right? You don't believe in Hercules, you believe some guy walked on water. What, are you out of your mind? Right? It's just a bunch of fairy tales from shepherds, give me a break. So they don't believe in it stuff, but a lot of them take it further. And they say, and it's a good thing it's not true, because this system that's in this book and that is taught in Sundays at churches is monstrous, right? So that's what I'm grappling with here. We say, take Christianity at face value. Is that a system that one should, suppose you're an agnostic, do you wish it were true? And it's really just saying, well, unfortunately, I don't believe in fairy tales. It would be nice if it were true, but it's not. And I'm saying, in case you haven't encountered this perspective, some people go further. They say, it's not merely that I don't believe in it because I don't believe in the afterlife. It's that I'm glad it's not true. And so that's what I'm reading here. I want to just give it to you from Hitchens' own mouth. Let's say that the consensus is that our species, being the higher primates, Homo sapiens, has been on the planet for at least 100,000 years, maybe more. And he quotes some authorities as to how old Homo sapiens are. In order to be a Christian, you have to believe that for 98,000 years, our species suffered and died, most of its children dying in childbirth, most other people having a life expectancy of about 25 years, dying of their teeth. Famine, struggle, bitterness, war, suffering, misery, all of that for 98,000 years. Heaven watches this with complete indifference. And then, 2,000 years ago, thinks, that's enough of that, it's time to intervene. And the best way to do this would be by condemning someone to a human sacrifice somewhere in the less literate parts of the Middle East. Don't let's appeal to the Chinese, for example, where people can read and study evidence and have a civilization. No, let's go to the desert and have another revelation there. So Hitchens goes on, this is nonsense. It can't be believed by a thinking person. Why am I glad this is the case? to get to the point of the wrongness of Christianity, because I think the teachings of Christianity are immoral. The central one is the most immoral of all, and that is the one of vicarious redemption. You can throw your sins onto somebody else, vulgarly known as scapegoating. In fact, originating is scapegoating in the same area, the same desert. I can pay your debt if I love you. I can serve your term in prison if I love you very much. I can volunteer to do that. I can't take away your sins because I can't abolish your responsibility, and I shouldn't offer to do so. Your responsibility has to stay with you. Okay, he goes on. It even manages to pollute the central question, the word I just employed, the most important word of all, the word love, by making love compulsory, by saying you must love. You must love your neighbor as yourself, something you can't actually do. You'll always fall short, so you can always be found guilty. By saying you must love someone who you also must fear. That's to say a supreme being, an eternal Father, someone of whom you must be afraid, but you must love him too. If you fail in this duty, you're again a wretched sinner. This is not mentally or morally or intellectually healthy. We got one more paragraph where he's going to sum up. And that brings me to the final objection, which is this, that it's a totalitarian system. If there was a God who could do these things and demand these things of us, and he was eternal and unchanging, we'd be living under a dictatorship from which there is no appeal, and one that can never change, and one that knows our thoughts and can convict us of a thought crime and condemn us to eternal punishment for actions that we are condemned in advance to be taking. All this in the round, and I could say more, it's an excellent thing that we absolutely have no reason to believe any of it to be true. All right, so how do you feel, Mr. Hitchens? Tell us what you think, right? So you can see with that perspective, though, where he's not merely saying, come on, this is a bunch of silly myths, don't you guys know science? He's saying this system, if you actually believed it, is horrible and offensive to any sort of notion of morality and so forth and self-responsibility. Okay, so that's what I want to address from a modern libertarian perspective, let's say in the Rothbardian tradition, for those of you who know those terms, and to say that this actually doesn't work. All right, so with all this stuff, we're going to stipulate that if the Bible account of God and his nature were true, then would he actually be a totalitarian or a tyrant in the Hitchens sense? And so I'm going to argue that no, he wouldn't. And it's funny, when I try to make these arguments like on my blog and so forth, people hit back, and a lot of times they'll just revert to, oh, but come on, why should I believe in Christianity? Why don't you believe in all these other types of religions? So again, we're not fighting 16 different battles right now. The question is, which Hitchens himself laid on the table, is to say this doctrine in and of itself, does it follow that it's a totalitarian system, and so that's why we should be relieved it's not true? And so I'm going to, again, argue that that's not the case. So to do that, let me first read, let me just mention before I jump into the central issue, even with that long quote, and again, I didn't go looking for this. I had people who were atheist libertarians deliver this to me saying, this is great stuff, what can you guys possibly say to something like this? Notice, even on its own terms, it's pretty silly. All right, so some of his offhand remarks. So the one that jumped out at me was him saying, if God were going to deliver this message, why didn't he pick illiterate people to do it, right? As if God's saying, oh, wait a minute, you're right. I could have used a book to get my message out. Why didn't I think of that? Go with me here, folks, right? It's the best-selling book in human history was the one that got him, and so it's odd that Hitchens is saying, why didn't he think of using the written word, all right? Now, you could be more fair to say, no, what Hitchens was saying is, he could have gone a little bit in a different civilization, a little bit longer in time. Like, why didn't Jesus appear when there are all kinds of cameras on him and so forth, and medical doctors could have come. He could have raised Lazarus, and why couldn't guys in white coats have come out? Instead, we're getting these stories that are written down in books, and it's hard to know their authenticity. All right, so you could be fair and say that, but then that contradicts one of his other points, right? One of his points was, why did God wait so long to appear? Which actually isn't consistent with the biblical account, but you get where he's coming from, and so they can't both be true at the same time. Or both criticisms can't simultaneously be true. That on the one hand, God screwed up by waiting so long, and he's merciless for letting people suffer until he revealed himself. And why did God reveal himself so early to a pre-literate people? Why didn't he come later when there was all kinds of technology that could have documented his miracles, right? So this stuff happens a lot. Once you become a Christian and start looking at these things, stuff that I'm sure in college, if I had read that excerpt from Hitchens, I would have been like, oh yeah, that's awesome. How can anyone believe this stuff? He's got 19 different objections all in 3 paragraphs, not realizing that several of those objections actually counteract each other. Okay, but going on to the heart of it, let me read from Rothbard. So this is from the Ethics of Liberty, page 34. Rothbard's here talking about Robinson Crusoe and how is it that Crusoe comes to own anything. right? And you'll see why I'm going into this in a minute. But let's just first establish this. So Rothbard says, let us now return to our analysis of Crusoe's purposeful transformation of nature-given data through the understanding of natural laws. Crusoe finds virgin, unused land on the island, land, in short, unused and uncontrolled by anyone, and hence unowned. By finding land resources, by learning how to use them, and by transforming them, that Crusoe has, in the memorable phrase of John Locke, mixed his labor with the soil. In doing so, in stamping the imprint of his personality and his energy on the land, he has naturally converted the land and its fruit into his property. Hence, the isolated man owns what he uses and transforms. I'm skipping ahead. Any man's property is ipso facto what he produces. In other words, what he transforms into use by his own effort. Okay, so if the Genesis account is true, literally every molecule of the physical universe God created from scratch, de novo, right? So according to standard libertarian theory, God owns everything. He is the owner. He is the ultimate sovereign. I motivate this sometimes, again, being sort of cheeky, by saying atheist libertarians love the homesteading principle, except when it comes to God. Right? That's the one place where they say, no, that doesn't work. And I'm not just setting up a straw man. Like they go nuts if you make that argument. And they want to say, no, just because God created everything doesn't mean he owns it. I was like, what are you talking about? Can't you read Rothbard? Of course he does. All right. Now, in fairness, you could try to wiggle out and say, all right, maybe he doesn't own, people's bodies, because there it gets a little bit odd. I think it's actually a problem within standard Rothbardian theory. I don't think it's a problem with applying it to Christianity or the Christian historical narrative of what happened in terms of the creation of the universe. But there is a sense in which there are some arguments to try to ground somebody's ownership of your own body that you could argue that would still apply, even if all this stuff were created. But still, let's quote from Rothbard, and I don't want to make people uncomfortable here, but this is Rothbard talking about abortion, and you'll see why it's relevant. So this is from page 98 of the Ethics of Liberty. The proper groundwork for analysis of abortion is in every man's absolute right of self-ownership. This implies immediately that every woman has the absolute right to her own body, that she has absolute dominion over her body and everything within it. This includes the fetus. Most fetuses are in the mother's womb because the mother consents. Okay. But should the mother decide that she does not want the fetus there any longer, then the fetus becomes a parasitic invader, and he's got invader in quotation marks, of her person, and the mother has the perfect right to expel this invader from her domain. Abortion should be looked upon not as murder, his quotation marks, of a living person, but as the expulsion of an unwanted invader from the mother's body. All right, and then Walter Block also takes this notion of evictionism and applies it in other contexts. If you're not familiar with Walter Block, you've been missing out. He has all sorts of wonderful thought experiments where he pushes the envelope to really test libertarian theory and to show, strange circumstances. How would you apply these things in this case? So, for example, from chapter 10 of the non-aggression axiom of libertarianism, that's the title of the chapter, the non-aggression axiom of libertarianism. The book is Building Block for Liberty. Block discusses, I'll just read a little bit just to set it up. He's imagining this scenario where you're standing on the balcony of a 25th story high-rise apartment when, much to your dismay, you lose your footing and you fall out. Happily, in your downward descent, you manage to grab a flagpole protruding from the 15th floor of the balcony of another apartment that's 10 floors below. Unhappily, the owner of this apartment comes out to her balcony, states that you are protesting by holding onto her, or you're invading by holding onto her flagpole, and demands that you let go. In other words, drop another 15 floors to your death. You protest that you only want to hand walk your way down the flagpole into her apartment and then right out of it, but she is adamant. As a libertarian, are you bound to obey her? Okay, so, and just in case you don't know Walter Block, the answer is tough luck for you, you're dead, right? Or at least she would be within her libertarian rights to pull out a gun and say, let go of that, my flagpole, that's my property, get out, right? And there's no sort of way of, at the very least, if the person tries to come in and she goes to shoot the person to say, let go of my flagpole, you're on my property, I don't care that you came here accidentally and you're not trying to be a criminal, get out, that it would be immoral for anyone else to use force to stop her from violently, expelling the person from the property. And again, and Walter also agrees with Rothbard in terms of the abortion issue, so they sort of cleverly sidestep the question of where does life begin. They're saying it doesn't matter whether the fetus is a human or not, entitled to full rights. The point is the woman owns her body, she's a sovereign over her body, she has the right to expel the fetus. Okay, now, to be clear, lots of self-described libertarians think Rothbard and Block and so on, that they're totally wrong on this. But most of those people that I know in practice are Catholics, right? So it's very few atheist libertarians that I've seen. I'm not saying they don't exist, but I'm saying usually it's theistic libertarians who think, yeah, Rothbard and Block kind of went off the rails on this stuff. But my point is, if you understand that and you can see where they're coming from, right? It's not they're just going crazy. It's just, you might say they're sort of single-mindedly applying this principle dogmatically. Okay, but then again, by the same token, even if you think you have, you own yourself just through introspection and using certain deductive reasoning from axioms of action and so on, clearly, if the Bible account, if the Genesis account is true, God owns everything else, including like the oxygen that's in your lungs. And so clearly, God has the right to lay down rules and to say, oh, you need to get circumcised, you need to do X, Y, and Z. And just like the bar owner can say to people, hey, we're not telling you have to go home, but you can't stay here, God is perfectly within his rights to say, referring to the earth and heaven, I'm not saying you got to go to hell, but you can't stay here, right? He could say that. He would have that right to do that in terms of libertarian rights. So again, and I can imagine atheist libertarians rolling their eyes, okay, yeah, the Genesis account, but that was the terms of the debate. They were saying if the Bible, even if it were true, it would be a horrific system. So I'm establishing, no, follow your own principles, right? If you're willing to say, as Walter is in other contexts, for example, if somebody stows away in a plane, right? The pilots are flying the plane, some company owns it, and they realize some kid stowed away in it. The pilot, Walter thinks, at least without contracts to the contrary or some other sort of legal precedent, but just in terms of standard libertarian property rights theory, the owner of the plane can say to the stowaway, I'm sorry that you're here, but this is my property, get out, right? And I'm not the one killing you, I'm just telling you to get off my property, right? They have the right to do that. And again, Walter revels in stuff like that, so hopefully maybe Walter and I will co-author an article about why God has the power to banish people to hell, or the libertarian right, right? So that's, I'm not even kidding, I'm going to jot that down, I'm going to co-author another article with Walter. Okay, so again, I hope I've established, using standard libertarian theory, if the Bible account were true, God is not a tyrant in the sense of violating property rights, right? So it's at best you could say he's a king who actually does legally own everything in the realm, and people are tilling the soil and having to rightfully give him stuff. So now the question then is, okay, but is he a nice guy about it, right? So in other words, okay, maybe he has the legal right, but isn't this still sort of a draconian system and a merciless being in charge? And so here, there's different ways, or I think we need to break this up. So in terms of, I think the mistake is to say, which people understandably do, they think, well, if a human ruler did some of the things that the God, especially as depicted in the Old Testament, did, we wouldn't trust that person. We would say, oh, wow, that's a real jealous, fickle person, and oh my goodness, and that's pretty harsh punishment. You can understand certain things in the Old Testament where an atheist reading that would say, wow, if a human ruler did anything in the same ballpark as that, we would not be comfortable. Even if he somehow had the legal right to do that stuff, you would still want to say, I don't trust that person. But I think part of what's going on there is the fact that he is God. And so let me break it up. Certainly when God became a man, again, taking the Bible, assuming that those accounts are correct and that's the accurate description of reality, Jesus was easily the most wonderful role model in human history, right? That even atheists often acknowledge, oh yeah, Jesus was a great moral teacher, provided a great example. Most secularists don't have a huge problem with people saying, what would Jesus do? I mean, they might try to make funny jokes or something in certain circumstances, but they certainly get where people are coming from, and most people, even who reject Christianity in terms of its doctrines, have no problem acknowledging that Jesus, the man depicted and how he lived his life and interacted with his neighbors in the gospel accounts is wonderful. And they might just say, well, I think some of those stories might have been exaggerated or something, right? But no one's going to say that Jesus, living as a man, giving us an example of how to live our own lives, did anything incorrect or was a tyrant in any way. Far from it. All right, so in terms of saying how does God want us to live, and in terms of us emulating his behavior, certainly I would say Christianity gets passes with flying colors in that respect. And then you could say, okay, but what if, what about certain things that God in his capacity as God the Father did, Old Testament and so on? Again, I think there really is an important distinction between saying, well, he is God, and that it doesn't work to say what can humans do versus what does God have the right to do. And we know this, even the secular culture has this phrase to say, oh, you can't play God, right? When do people invoke that phrase? They mean when humans are dabbling in stuff that it's dangerous for humans to be messing with, right? So people might say that in terms of like genetically modifying a fetus in the womb or something to make the kid have certain characteristics. Somebody might say, we're playing God, we can't play God, right? Or other things about maybe predicting the future and like knowing, this person might grow up to be a serial killer, so let's just arrest him right now. Or you might say, that's playing God, okay? So things like that where it's areas where we know from experience and just the nature of humans, that's not something humans should be dabbling with. But it doesn't mean those things shouldn't happen ever, right? Or you might say, like people might say, assisted suicide on the deathbed, that, we're playing God, right? It doesn't mean you think everybody should live forever on earth, right? It doesn't mean you think death should never happen, or what, determining things in terms of what the fetus's characteristics are going to be when the baby's born. You don't mean, God shouldn't be the one, you shouldn't have anything to do with babies being born, and we just shouldn't have that. Right? What you mean is that's something that should be left to God. Now let me give you an example of that to sort of drive home this distinction, how silly it is to try to apply the same logic to the God of the Bible as you would to a human ruler. Take something like the Noah's flood, right? And this comes up a lot. Again, when I'm arguing with atheist libertarians, they'll call that genocide, or even what's the next level, right? Where you're like wiping out all of humanity. There's some other side that is. I don't know. Does anyone know? Okay, well, it's bad, right? That if some human ruler got upset with all of humanity and killed everybody except a few people who got into one ark, most people would say, whoa, that guy, even if he had the legal right to do that, wow, that escalated quickly, right? They might think that was a big response, okay? And so the question is, does that mean God is this maniacal ruler who kills people? But again, think through. If the Bible is true, if the God of the Bible exists, everything that happens is consistent with his will. So if he hadn't flooded the earth, those people would not have lived forever. They would have died of old age. Someone would have, fallen off a cliff. Someone would have been eaten by a tiger, right? So the point is, God would have killed them all in that way too, right? It's not that, God killed them with the flood, but otherwise they would have died of natural causes, right? God is in charge of everything. He's ultimately sovereign. So no matter how you die, there's a sense in which God killed you. Right? And so that doesn't mean God is the murderer of everything. It means God created everything. It's his story, and things happen. And if you ever do die, then that's in a sense because God killed you. And then again, you could say, all right, well, why does he create a world where people die? But notice that sort of counteracts another typical objection to say, why does he make us suffer or whatever? Well, you could argue the sooner you die, then the sooner the suffering is over. So it's, again, this stuff gets really complicated, and it's hard to be consistent about, but it's because it's hard for us to comprehend what it would be like to be God. There's the nature of that being that creates everything and creates humans, and they have certain finite lives, and then that's ended. It's hard for us to grapple with that, and yes, it is true. If some human ruler tried to start doing that kind of stuff, we would be horrified, but it's not because that stuff shouldn't be done. It's because it's not appropriate for a human to do that. A human has no right or theological or legal to do that sort of stuff, but God certainly does. So a lot of these objections that if you really push them, it ultimately comes down to people complaining and saying, why did God create us? I wish we had never been born, right? I mean, some of it really does. I'm not setting up a straw man. It gets pushed into that realm, and you could say, well, I understand if you're upset like that, but it's hardly a compelling objection when it gets pushed to that level. All right, let me keep going here. I want to save some time for your guys' questions. So Hitchens, if you remember, he wasn't merely talking about, the sort of punishments that God has set up, but he also was saying that there's something wrong or terrifying about this idea of vicarious redemption, right? Does God have the power to forgive sins? Let me put it that way. So certainly in the gospel accounts, Jesus was challenged about that and said, well, who is this? Does he have the power to forgive sins? And how did Jesus answer that? He said, well, what's easier, to forgive sins or tell this man to get up and walk? And so he does that. And so there is a sense in which you could say, well, God can do anything. So can he forgive his sins? Yes, that's something. God can do anything. All right, and QED. But beyond that, again, if you're coming at it from a libertarian, atheist, or secularist perspective, of course God has the power to forgive sins because everything is a sin against his stuff, right? And so this kind of ties in, I could tie it in biblically to, David sleeps with Bathsheba, gets her pregnant, he's in an awkward position, he ends up getting Uriah killed, but then when he confesses his sin, what does he say? He doesn't say, I've sinned against Uriah or Bathsheba. He says, against you only have I sinned. And, when I was younger, I thought that was a little bit off, but of course now, as I'm older, I'm realizing, no, that's entirely correct. And so if you want to interpret it from a Rothbardian lens, you could say that anything you do, like you go and punch somebody in the face, you could say, oh, I aggressed against that guy? Well, no, because that's God's property, right? And to give a goofy analogy, to see where I'm coming from, imagine you and your buddies, you go out and you go to like a go-kart, racetrack, and you get in the carts and you're driving around and somebody comes over and smacks into the cart and like smashes the side of the door. You personally aren't hurt, but smashes the door of the go-kart, and you get up, you go, what are you doing? You hit my car. And the owner comes out and says, whoa, what happened? He finds out and says, it's okay. This is normal wear and tear. We know this kind of stuff happens. No problem. I'm not upset. You, the one driving that go-kart who got hit, you have no standing. You can't say, no, you don't have the power to do that. He hit me while I was driving. You say, you were using my car, right? You were here because of me. I could tell you to get off my property if I wanted to. You were using my stuff. It was my stuff that was damaged, and I have the power to say it's okay, right? So you could, again, invoke that and say he certainly does have the power to forgive sins, because ultimately, if you want to get real legalistic about it, he owns everything. Anything that you do that's immoral or improper is a violation against the rules he himself set up, and it's his property in a fully Rothbardian sense, not just like a metaphor, but if the Bible's literally true, then he literally owns everything. Also, just as an aside, notice too that it does reconcile itself, right? And so some of Hitchens' objections, like I said, they sort of counteract each other or cancel out. And this happens a lot, and it's also the danger with just being like a halfway Christian, if you will, and like picking and choosing some of the stuff from the Bible and saying, well, yeah, I get this stuff, but this other stuff, I don't know about that. That you're trying to fill stuff in with your reason, and a lot of times it doesn't work, right? And it leads to contradictions. But taking everything, the full Christian doctrine and all of its elements, it makes sense, because remember, Hitchens was complaining simultaneously about how can Jesus take your sins upon himself and you be forgiven through him? That doesn't make sense. That's offensive to me. And also he was complaining, saying, how can I be commanded to love someone as myself? That is impossible. I couldn't possibly do that. Well, notice how those go together, right? That yes, God's setting a standard for your behavior that is impossible for you to fulfill on your own power, but that doesn't mean, so we're all going to hell. No, that Jesus is there to, sacrifice and take it upon himself, and he accomplishes it through his sacrifice, right? So the two things go together. So Hitchens is viewing it as, here's problem number one of Christianity, here's problem number two. But of course, from the Christian point of view, you'd say that's how it all fits together. And yes, that's not something you would have invented off the top of your head, right? You would have thought that, well, this is getting kind of complicated. But to me, that's more reason to show this is something that comes from the divine. This is not some mere thing that men cooked up 2,000 years ago when they were scribbling in the desert, the way Christopher Hitchens thinks. Okay, I got just a few more points here, and I'll turn it over to your guys' questions. All right, so this issue of free will. Hitchens didn't hit it so much here, but on my blog, like about a week ago, I posted a question saying, hey guys, I'm talking about, is God a tyrant? And, especially if you're an atheist, by all means, like, make your case. I want to be able to, take this head on and from people who actually believe this. And so one of the big things was, people saying we don't have we don't have free will, right? I guess Hitchens did talk about it a little bit. He said something like you're condemned to do this before you were born or something. So the doctrine of original sin and the idea that depending on your understanding of God's sovereignty and predestination and so on. I know some of us might not all be on the same page with that, but clearly there is a sense in which if you were an atheist, you could be a little bit uncomfortable about the idea of someone knowing beforehand what you were going to do, and in some cases even causing it, right? And there's famous passages in Scripture like God hardened Pharaoh's heart. So stuff like there where it goes beyond merely, God is omniscient and predicted in advance what everyone was going to do. There's certain passages that make it certainly sound as if God caused the sin, or at least that was consistent with his plan and what have you. And I know this is really tricky stuff, and we probably all have different ways that we would talk about this. But let's just grapple with that on its own terms. And again, I'm here. I'm going to just use an analogy. Right? This is just an analogy I come up with. It for some people, it helps them at least understand the perspective. Other people think it's silly, but here goes. I use a Star Wars analogy. You can just do about anything you want with Star Wars. There's theology in there. There's all kinds of stuff in there. So just think of it like this, that when it comes to, in terms of, we're talking about free will, So the famous scene when the stormtroopers are looking for the droids, and Ben Kenobi is like, "These are not the droids you're looking for." He's like, "These are not the droids we're looking for," right? And he goes, by the way, my friend had this buddy. He loved that when the new Star Wars came out and they were doing that. So he was going around to parties and going to people, "You will get me a beer." It didn't work, but he was trying it. So there you could say, let's say the stormtroopers got hauled in and Vader's yelling at him or something. "What are you doing?" The droids were right there, and they could correctly say, "We had no control of that he took control of our mind. It was a Jedi mind trick. We didn't choose to do that. You shouldn't get mad at us," right? And that would be, they probably would still get killed, but that would be, Vader would not be correct in doing so. He would be mean, right? So that would be unfair because they really couldn't control what they were doing. In contrast, what about Anakin Skywalker? He gets seduced by the dark side, right? The Emperor Palpatine, you could say, tricks him, but when you say, does Anakin choose to do horrible things like slaughter a bunch of children with his lightsaber, you say, yeah, he chose to do that. He had free will. He was misled, or he was lied to, and so on. There was a malevolent being that was trying to urge him to violate what he knew to be the right moral thing to do, but nonetheless, it was not that he was taken over and his body was physically moved by someone else's will. He chose to do those crimes or sins. And so he's morally culpable for that stuff. Whereas the stormtrooper, stopping the droids would have been the wrong thing to do. But you get what I'm saying, where they really weren't morally culpable. They were not in control of their actions. Whereas in the story of Star Wars, certainly Anakin is morally culpable for that stuff. But now what if somebody said, no, he's not, because George Lucas made him do that? You see what I mean? And there is a sense in which, yeah, you're right, he did. Right? Anakin had no choice. There's no way Anakin Skywalker would have rejected the Emperor and not become Darth Vader. There wouldn't have been a story. Right? There was no way the author of that story made that happen, knew from the beginning Anakin is going to choose. But yet if you say, does Anakin Skywalker have free will? Yes, he does. Right? To the extent you think it makes sense to even say he exists. Right? You can say, come on, it's a stupid story. What do you mean does he have free will? He doesn't exist. He's a fictional thing. Okay, but if you want to get into the logic and the universe of the story, then clearly he does have free will. Right? So that's the analogy I try to use with people to say, yeah, God knows what's going to happen. He's telling a story, if you will. It's his story, history, but the characters he creates, they do have free will, and they are morally culpable in whatever sense that means anything. Right? Even though God, in a sense, knows what's going to happen, and he needs people to do certain things for the story to be fulfilled. It's not that he's caught off guard. Oh my gosh, I can't believe they kept sinning. I guess, well, what am I going to do now? He knows obviously what's going to happen. That's part of the plan. Okay, and then let me wrap up on this issue. Since I brought up Emperor Palpatine and so on, let me talk just for a few minutes. I wrote an article one time for LouRockwell.com called "The Hope of Victory," and in there, what I was getting at is, well, two things. So number one is, of course, it's a shame and it's regrettable from our point of view if there are libertarians, any people, but libertarians in particular, who don't believe in God, right? Because you're missing out on here, this wonderful story. It's good news, right? It's salvation. You can spend eternity in paradise with this wonderful being who loves you and created love and mathematics and everything. I want to share this with you, but also, to me, I think it's very naive when I see other people out there who are libertarians fighting against the state, or maybe they don't like the New World Order, and they don't think there's a devil, right? And I'm thinking, you are horribly outgunned. You have no idea what you're up against, right? Whereas I think Christian libertarians really do understand, spiritual warfare, and they understand that, the prince of this world is the devil. So it's not merely that, oh yeah, there's some guys in the Bilderberg group, and there's a few bankers here smoking cigars we got to watch out for. That no, ultimately there is this malevolent being that is trying to destroy everyone and get them to do things, who revels in human suffering. And so I think it's very naive when libertarians don't get that. Also, I think this is the last point I'll make, that there's a sort of inconsistency, right? There's certain heroes of liberty who are atheists, or at least agnostic, and I don't want to push the point too hard, because I don't want them to abandon their heroism. Right? I don't want them, but it's sort of where are you getting that from? All right, and so the one I have in particular is Ludwig von Mises, because he didn't even endorse the natural law tradition. Like somebody like Rothbard, you could say, well, he believed in these principles, they burned with a passion in him, and so that's where he got it from, even if he wasn't sure about, is there an afterlife, is there this creator being? But Mises explicitly rejected natural law theory. He was a utilitarian, a very sophisticated one, but a utilitarian nonetheless. And so you wonder, why did he devote his life when he easily could have collaborated with, the Nazis or whatever? He could have done certain things and worked with the state, but he didn't do that. He did not have his professional success and money and so forth, other things that, according to his own stated viewpoint, might have made more sense. And let me put it to you this way: I think a lot of atheist libertarians are fooling themselves if they think reason and empiricism alone lead to their own, explain their actions, right? So let me motivate it this way. If, let's say, Ayn Rand's here and she gets Putin and the guys in the Bilderberg group and, Hillary Clinton, or whoever, the person is that you're trying to convince to abandon their evil ways, she gets them into a room. She's like, fellas, I noticed that you've been, intervening in the market economy. I'm like, yeah. And she goes, but A is A, right? And they're, yeah, what's your point, right? And you go through it, and I'm saying there's no chain of argumentation by which they would say, oh yeah, you're right, we should renounce our power, right? To motivate that, you could say to somebody, hey, if we all, if nobody's a farmer, then we'll all starve to death. And they say, right? And says, therefore, we should all be farmers. And he said, no, that doesn't follow at all, right? So by the same token, the stuff Mises showed in his writing is that if everybody respected property rights, we'd all be fantastically wealthy compared to a world where nobody respects property rights. But from that, it does not follow that you should follow property rights. You have to already have some antecedent theory saying there's a moral code that applies to everybody in certain ways and that there has to be a symmetry involved, and I can't place myself on a higher plane than my fellow human being. And I'm saying I've never seen a purely rational demonstration of that. Whereas if you're a Christian, you get all that stuff as bonus, right? That everything makes sense. You can make sense of the world. Whereas it's not that the people running the states are ignorant of economics. They know that stuff. And yet it seems like the stuff that happens is more than simply, a mistake, or yes, some people have the lust for power. It seems like there's more than that. Whereas if you think there's a devil, that makes perfect sense as to human history. So the last thing I'll end here with is a quote from Romans as to why I think this is, if you have a Christian perspective, it makes sense of all this stuff, and it grounds your fight for human liberty, that it makes sense that okay, this is just a fleeting moment here, this life on this earth, and that what we're doing has higher significance, and we're ultimately not doing this for worldly success, but for following the will of our Father. So he says, may the God of hope fill you with all joy and peace as you trust in him, so that you may overflow with hope by the power of the Holy Spirit. So thank you for your attention, and I'll entertain any questions.